So yesterday I was watching a video by Fred Davis, whom some of you might know. And I forget what the name of the video was, but the topic was surrender. And one of the things that stuck out was he said something along the lines of that he knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no self and nothing can convince him otherwise, and that he's been doing it for nearly 4 decades, and it was a very strong statement, and it stuck out, and I really wanted to touch upon that, specifically this concept of no self. For me, this no self has virtually no reality whatsoever. I do actually like Fred Davis. He seems like a really likable guy, and he does have some perspectives that I do see as absolutely valid. One thing he said was that suffering drives us to know the truth, and I think that is very much the case. He mentioned that virtually everyone he knew was drawn to non-duality because of that very thing, because of suffering and wanting to get oneself out of suffering. So that drives us to, well, what is causing the suffering? So I think Fred Davis has a lot of insights. As he said, he's been doing it for a long time. So I do think that's legitimate. But the idea of no self is something I see as having neither experiential or practical merit. However, there is an exception to that. And historically, I think the concept of no self arose, and this is speculation, but the origins appear to be associated with the teaching itself. Notably in, Zen Buddhism, for example. When a teacher is trying to convey the message to the student, it can be as unhelpful as it is helpful to use positive pointers. And by positive, I mean messages that are substantive and filled with definition, and are not the idea of no self is fundamentally, if there's no self, there's nothing. There's nothing for our thinking, you can, but there's nothing for thinking to really latch onto. You could, and people do, and they think about it for hours, and so the struggle continues, essentially. But I think the concept of no self, originally intended to be no concept, not a concept, because we have to use words, it seems to be that it originated in teachers trying to teach students who didn't know, who haven't had any substantial realization whatsoever, So, in that sense, it's not to be taken literally. In my experience, neither experientially nor practically does no-self doctrine have any reality. And thinking purely on a logical level, if there is no self, then there is no one to experience anything at all. So, if we're thinking on a logical level, it doesn't make sense. But on an experiential level, nor does it make sense as well, because and I'm well aware that when we say no self, there are a lot of times in discourse people will make distinctions between ego and self, or self with a little s versus self with a big S, and I think those distinctions are valid for the most part. Though in reality there doesn't appear to be a literal separation between the two. But in discourse it's helpful to make distinctions like that. So, having said all that, this can be, as viewers, as people who viewed my other videos know, my attempt is to convey my views and thoughts from an experiential perspective, and that's what I'm most interested in. If we regard no self within the context of teaching, it may be helpful, but I do think that there are more nuanced ways to go about cracking someone open, so to speak, other than just saying, there is no self, no one is experiencing anything, there's no one here, no one is home, and no one is, ultimately doing anything. I was a little puzzled to hear him say so. Fred said that nothing could convince him otherwise, and so he says it with a lot of confidence. My question would be whether or not for those 4 decades he was simply receiving his own confirmation bias, or whether or not he has had other experiences that might actually contradict the idea of no self. But if you go further in his videos, it does seem to indicate that perhaps he's more inclined to be in the teacher position, and he does mention that that's part of what he does, is to help those who are in a position of they haven't realized oneness, they don't, and thinking is still very much a substantial perceived barrier to them. So I can see from that perspective that he would be inclined to say that there is no self. But in a more literal perspective, if he's, maybe talking to one of his guru friends, why one would be inclined to perpetuate the delusion that there is no self. My impression is that of all of the illusions that can arise, and there are many, and they're innumerable, the reality of the self is the one thing that really isn't an illusion. Now, if we coat and decorate the self with all of these features, then yeah, you could say that it doesn't have an ultimate reality. But if we consider that the self, aside from its manifestations, aside from its creations, aside from any features you could add on top of that, the self almost is certainly, well, it is you. You could say the self exists, and you might say that that is not really true because it's not in a dimension that is, in a manifest dimension. It is you at your core. You are the self, and you are the witnessing presence that is also giving reality to everything that surrounds us, which has been described as, formless and timeless, which in some sense that's true, but again, I come at this all from an experiential perspective. So even those words are kind of adding layers on top of it. But in an absolute sense, I would say that the self is real, but with all of those caveats in mind. So it's not very straightforward, but there is, without a doubt, someone there. It's not just energy swirling around in some unknown reality that could collapse into nothingness at any moment. And maybe it would, if that's what the self wants to experience. But ultimately, my impression is that the only thing that has any absolute reality is the self. Everything else can fall away, but not the self.